I want to begin with something. I wasn't planning on starting with it, but I just learned about it, shockingly enough. Apparently it happened some hours ago. And that's the death of Ted Olson. Ted Olson was probably, no, not probably, one of the greatest Supreme Court litigators ever. Ever. I knew him for quite some time. In the last number of years, our friendship wasn't altered in any respect, but we didn't really keep in touch. There's just so much going on in everybody's life. He was involved in a few cases I didn't necessarily agree with, but this is the way he was. If he believed something needed to be supported and defended, that's what he did. You might remember in Bush versus Gore, he represented Bush, and he defeated David Boies in the Supreme Court. That was a big deal. He worked in the Reagan Justice Department for a good period of time. And when he left there, he went into private practice. He was a hugely sought-after litigator. Now, we worked together a lot during Iran-Contra. When that matter broke, I represented former Attorney General Ed Meese when I had left the Department of Justice. He represented President Reagan. It was very brutal litigation that most people didn't know about. It was litigation in secret. It was a very nasty law, the Independent Counsel Act, as we called it. And we were up against these extraordinarily powerful independent counsel, in this case, Lawrence Walsh. Landmark represented Meese. I was the lead litigator. And I did it, and I wanted to do it for free, and that's what we did. Walsh was coming after Reagan. He was coming after George W. Bush. He was coming after Ed Meese. He was coming after Donald Regan. He went after Weinberger, which was an atrocious, unethical act. Just looking for scalps everywhere. I must have spent the entire summer, I forget which year, at the courthouse in Washington, D.C. We were not allowed to actually access the grand jury information that Walsh had used, in my view, unconstitutionally, and I raised it in the secret litigation, and they ruled against me. 2-1 was a panel. And I said, well, by God, we have a right to respond to this, and I want to respond to it, and I need to use that information. The court said I could on a very limited basis. They would not allow me to take any copies of the grand jury information. I literally, and back in those days, had to sit at a table in Judge Sentel's office, a circuit court judge who was on the panel, in his conference room, and pick up this, rather sizable microphone connected to this tape recording machine and read from the transcript. And it got so bad I actually had sour balls there popping in my mouth because my throat was so raw. And I did it for 3 months. We filed a motion. I wanted access to other people's information and so forth. And the court ruled that I could actually talk to the other lawyers, but I could not talk to the president's lawyer, Ted Olson, which was bizarre. Ted Olson was free to talk to anybody he wanted to. I was free to talk to anybody I wanted to except Ted Olson, and yet I needed to know what information they had in order to write the response, the report, to the report. So I called Ted, who was an old friend of mine, and I said, hey, Ted, I'm not allowed to contact you about information related to this case, but you are allowed to contact me. I said, do you understand what I mean? He said, yes. I'll see you tomorrow at noon in my office. So he had asked me to meet with him. And we wrote a response, a very extensive response, to the independent counsel's report. He didn't indict Ed Meese because Ed Meese didn't do anything wrong, and he didn't indict a number of people. But he had indicted Caspar Weinberger. It was outrageous. Not for actually committing an offense, but for obstruction. What did he do? He had sent all of his notes to the National Archives, which had been placed in the secure area with classified information. And the independent counsel said he wasn't supposed to do that. He was supposed to send it to him. And so they charged him. And in D.C., if you're Republican, you're guilty the minute you walk into that city. It was the disgrace. Caspar Weinberger was a tremendous hero, built up our military, helped defeat the Soviet Union. Just tremendous. Now, we challenged the constitutionality of the independent counsel statute. We challenged the constitutionality of his report, the use of 11E grand jury information. And we lost. And his report came out. Our reports were attached. I sat down with former Attorney General Meese. And I said to him, again, I was out of the government, so was he, and I said to him, Landmark, we had prepared a brief to go all the way to the Supreme Court. At the time we contacted Chief Justice Ring. I've never explained this, have I, Mr. Producer? We contacted Chief Justice William Rehnquist's office. We told them that within the next 3 or 4 hours we were going to file a brief that was loaded with this grand jury information, taking on the prosecutor and everything else. It needed to be done in secret, believe it or not. At least to that point. We were actually given information on how to go to the court through the back door. We would be met by a court martial, how they would accept it. And I sat down with Attorney General Meese and Brad Reynolds, who was fantastic, Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division. Had been. We sat together and I said, okay, Mr. Meese, he always said, call me Ed. So I started to call him Ed. All right, Ed, what do you want to do? I want to show you what a remarkable man Ed Meese is. He said, I don't want us to file it. I said, well, it's ready to go. He said, it's okay. He said, what's Ted Olson going to do on behalf of Reagan? And I had spoken to Ted, and he told me that the President Reagan, had decided to let the report out. He had nothing to hide, even though it was outrageous. And Ed Meese said to me, well, Mark, we can't then file. I said, what's your thinking on that? He said, President Reagan wants it out, and I'm in there filing that we don't want it out because of the violations of basic violations of law by this prosecutor. It'll look like I'm trying to cover up what took place on behalf of the president, even though the president himself made it public. He said, we can't do that. He said, what we're going to do is let it go public. Tell the court you're not filing. I said, well, I still call him Mr. Meese. I said, well, Mr. Meese, we're going to get creamed in the media here. I said, Don Regan doesn't know how to respond to this. Weinberger doesn't. George Shultz doesn't. President Reagan, who was beginning his decline, he doesn't. He said, then I'll do it. 3 weeks. Any show that wants to talk to me, good, bad, or indifferent, local, regional, state, national, I will do it. For 3 weeks. And then we'll stop. So he took it on his shoulders, and that's what he did. That's what he did. I've now told you things I don't believe I've ever told anybody else. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just the nature of the beast. It was the early 1990s. How long ago was that? Is that 35 years ago? Something like that? Anyway, Ted Olson was a gentleman. He was a very kind man. Several years ago, I don't remember, in Reston Town Center, outside of Washington, D.C., I was having a steak dinner, I think with my daughter. My wife will remind me if she was there. I think she was there. And Ted was sitting in another booth with his son. I hadn't seen him. It was dark in there, and he called over, and we spent a little time together. He was fantastic, as always. Again, he was involved in some cases you might not agree with, some cases I didn't agree with, but they weren't based on politics. They were based on his principled beliefs. And he's passed away, unfortunately. You know, It's true what they say. It really is. It's true what they say. Remember as a kid listening to the radio, listening to WABC as a kid from Philadelphia. As a big reach. And I was listening to a broadcaster by the name of Gene Shepard. And most of these great broadcasters, Gene Shepard, Cousin Brucey, others, they moved back and forth between WABC and WOR. They just did. It's the way it worked. Some of that will take place again, I'm sure. And my favorite, Bob Grant, he and I were very, very close, became best friends, actually. But I remember Gene Shepard, who was very cerebral and very entertaining. I remember him saying, and I've told you this, folks, 500 years from now, nobody will know who you are. The vast majority of us, there's obviously a handful of people who are remembered, some just tremendous people, some as evil as hell. But for the vast majority of us, we don't remember family members 500 years ago. And that was his point. I remember him saying that. I remember watching my favorite movie of all time, Patton, and I've watched it probably 50 times over the course of my life. And that speech that George C. Scott gives at the beginning. And that phrase, glory is fleeting. Glory is fleeting. Between what Gene Shepard had said when I was a kid, and I remembered it. And the first time I watched Patton, and I remembered that many, many years ago. Glory is fleeting. This is why when you have people on TV or radio or Hollywood, even in politics, who are egomaniacal, who think they're better than everybody else, who look down on everybody, when you meet them in person, they're not particularly polite. Nobody's going to remember them. Nobody's going to remember me. And that's why you need to have some level of humility. That's why you need to have, as I do, a special relationship with your audience, with you. In the moment, you may be a big shot, maybe. But in the end, you're not. You're just not. Ted Olson passed away today. And the vast majority of the American people won't know that he passed away, won't know who he was, what a critical role he played for Ronald Reagan, for the election of Bush, and so many other cases at the Department of Justice that mattered in the everyday lives of Americans. And so I take this time, may he rest in peace. There's at least one person who's not family who will remember him, and that's me.